Good morning. This is Inside the FLX from FingerLakes1.com. I'm Ted Baker, and today a pre-recorded conversation I caught up recently with Hans Walter-Peterson, viticulture specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension. He also leads the Finger Lakes Grape Program. We talked about the 2021 wine grape harvest, pest management, issues facing the industry moving forward. So let's hear from Hans Walter-Peterson. Joined by Finger Lakes Grape Program Viticulture Extension Specialist, Hans Walter-Peterson. I call him the Finger Lakes go-to grape guy. Hans, great to talk grapes with you once again.
Good to be with you, Ted.
So let's start with the background of this program. How long it's been around, and talk about the forming of the Finger Lakes Grape Program and your involvement with it.
So the Finger Lakes Grape Program, actually, we just had our 50th anniversary of the grape program as it kind of exists now. There's been an extension effort with grapes in the Finger Lakes region for a number of years before that. But the grape program is about 52 years old now. I think the formal formation of it was in 1969. So it's been around for quite a long time. And there hasn't been a whole lot of people in it. So I'm the, golly, I want to say I'm the fourth or fifth person in this job in those 50 years. Although I've been here for 15 years now almost, which is kind of crazy. So the grape program's been around for a long time and is kind of slowly evolved over those years. Obviously, the grape industry looked a lot different in 1969 than it does now, for sure. But the program now covers 6 counties. So it's Ontario County, Seneca, Steuben, Schuyler, Yates, and Wayne. I think I got them all. So that's the territory that I cover, and that covers 90% plus of the grapes in the Finger Lakes region that we would probably call it.
So there's some pretty good foresight in founding this program, because, in 1969, that's really before the modern era of the Finger Lakes wine industry began.
Yeah, it's several years before the passage of the Farm Winery Act, which is kind of the foundational legislation that basically allowed grape growers to start their own wineries. So without that, you wouldn't have the industry that we have now. Back 50 years ago, the industry was very much based on a lot of growers selling to a few pretty large companies for the most part. There are very few of the wineries that we know and recognize today. The only one that's kind of left in any extent is Bully Hill, which used to be the Taylor Wine Company, and what's, I guess, now E&J Gallo, but used to be Canandaigua Wine Company back in the day. So, some of the other players like Gold Seal are no longer around. Pleasant Valley is certainly around still, so that was another one that was there. So, but yeah, it's a very different industry. And so the program has had to kind of evolve as the industry has evolved.
How was this 2021 harvest that just came in?
Not our favorite, I'll put it that way. Most people who, if you live in the Finger Lakes, October especially was pretty wet. The amount of rain that we had in the different weather stations that we kind of monitored during the season had anywhere from 6 to 10 inches, I think, of rain in October. And so we get rain all year, so it's not like that's a terrible surprise. But we get a lot of rain and not a lot of time for it to dry out in between. That can really cause us some problems with just, you put too much water with anything and you start to get some molds and things like that. And so we had growers that had to dance around that, picking things, before rainstorms and things like that, which we're used to doing. But it still makes logistics harder and things like that. The crop this year was actually quite a bit larger than normal. Pretty much across the board. So if you were able to sell everything, growers were in pretty good shape as far as, and it got ripe enough and all that kind of thing. Growers did well from a yield standpoint. Not every single grape could be taken in this year. We have years like that when we have a big crop. some growers had to leave some stuff on the vine that just didn't have a home in the end. But that wasn't a huge amount, but certainly more than we're used to.
There's been a shift, at least somewhat over the years. Instead of paying for grapes by the pound, some wineries now pay by the acre. Is that movement growing?
I think so. There are a few places and a few growers who do that. Frankly, I would like to see more of that happen, just because it takes into account all the practices and all the things that growers have to do in order to bring in the best grapes possible. So if at the beginning of the season you agree to pay, $1,400 a ton is a relatively common price for Riesling this year, for example. But if you have to go out and do an extra spray or an extra pass of hand labor or something like that, that costs you money. And so when you're only paying by the ton, those practices don't necessarily get built into the cost of the practices that you're doing sometimes. And so if you're paying by the acre, basically the winery and the vineyard have a little bit more of a partnership a lot of times, and what happens in the vineyard, and the vineyard knows that even if we have to maybe drop some crop because of either it's very cool or because of rots like we had this year, they're still going to get that money that's been agreed to by the acre. So instead of expecting 4 tons to the acre and you get 2 tons to the acre, you lose money on that in that vineyard. If you had an agreed price per acre, then you know what you're going to get for that vineyard, even if you have to maybe drop some crop or you lose some to whatever happens. So it doesn't work for everybody necessarily, but in some cases it can be really good. And I think more wineries and growers should be exploring that option at least.
You mentioned Riesling, the number 1 wine grape in the Finger Lakes. Is there a number 2? Is there emerging consensus on what's going to be a number 2, or are there lots of number 2s?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask, I think. I think from an acreage standpoint, let's be clear, the number 1 grape in the Finger Lakes still is Concord.
Right.
There's twice as much Concord as there is Riesling. And all of that, most of that in the Finger Lakes is actually used for wine. But that aside, I know what you mean. If you're talking the kind of the European traditional varieties like Riesling and Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc and that kind of stuff, Chardonnay is probably number 2 in acreage. And then, after that, there's probably a bunch of them are probably grouped up after that. Cabernet Franc is certainly up there. I would suspect that, I'm just trying to remember the numbers that we've had most recently. Cabernet Franc, Pinot is climbing up a bit after kind of going down for a little bit. People are planting more of that again. Pinot Noir. And Gewürztraminer has actually been showing up a little bit more too, I think. So, but Riesling and Chardonnay are the 2 biggest of those vinifera types. Yep.
You just spent some time in a West Coast wine region, and it wasn't California; it was Washington State. What were you doing there?
Yeah, I was very fortunate. I was able to arrange some meetings with some colleagues out there. I have a good friend, former Cornell PhD grad, Michelle Moyer, who is the viticulture extension person out in the eastern part of the state there, and then another colleague at Oregon State, Patty Skinkus. So I was visiting them, kind of talking about some project ideas that we've had. In Washington State in particular, in that part of the state, they can actually get as cold as we do in the wintertime. And so they do some similar work that we do in monitoring the cold hardiness of grapevines during the wintertime. And so Michelle and I were kind of comparing some notes about kind of how we do that, and talking about some possible projects that we could work on kind of in parallel with each other in some ways, and just some other program ideas. But then it's always really good to have a chance to see another industry and to talk to people in another industry about how they do things, getting ideas about vineyard practices and why they do things like that. I was visiting some vineyards in Oregon with a friend, and he took me to one of the older wineries in the Willamette Valley, so which is well known for Pinot and Chardonnay and Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, and took me to a vineyard that's quite old for out there, and showed me, these massive Chardonnay vines that are on a trellis system that was actually developed in New York and is actually working very well for them. We don't see it, we hardly see it in New York anymore, just because it's hard to, takes more handwork to do. But this winery has kept that Chardonnay on that trellis system called Geneva Double Curtain, because it works pretty well for them, and it's kind of a historical artifact in some ways. So it's just kind of fun to see some different things and talk to people about getting different ideas.
I want to talk about some of the research you've done. I was at a talk you gave a while back talking about, for example, planting certain kinds of row crops between the rows of grapes and the effect that can have on vines. Tell us a little bit about that research and some of the other things you're working on.
So one of the big things that's being looked at both by the industry and some of us in the research area, not just in New York, but other parts of the world too, is more active use of cover crops in our vineyards. In our vineyards, for the most part in New York, we keep things, we just have the bare sod or native sod. So the native covers the weeds and dandelions and grasses and clovers and things like that just pop up naturally. But there are some places that will, and some vineyards that will plant certain cover crops in between to help break up compaction or help to make better soil aggregates, better soil structure, or provide nutrients or things like that. But one of the biggest topics that we're looking at now is can we maintain a cover crop under the vines? Kind of the standard practice in most of viticulture right now is to keep a bare strip under the grapevines themselves. So we can have about an 18-inch to sometimes up to 3-foot band of just bare dirt. And that's usually kept either with herbicides or cultivation. And we're trying to figure out good ways to keep cover crops under those vines as a way of promoting soil health, reducing erosion, which in our neck of the woods is important because a lot of our vineyards are on slopes. So we're trying to look at ways to do that. So one of the projects I was working on, I think what the one I was talking about when you were there, Ted, was looking at a way can we develop a simple mechanism to seed those cover crops under the grapevines and kind of get them to establish in the first place. The next step then is we're starting to see some growers, and we're a couple more units are coming into the region probably in the next year or so. Are looking at mowers that will mow between the grapevines, because the problem with weeds under the grapevines is if they get too tall, they block access to the grapes, especially some of the premium wine grapes that are on these lower trellises where the fruit is closer to the ground. So if the weeds get too high, they block it and make it harder for disease control and things like that. So that's a very long way of basically going about saying we're trying to increase the amount of ground that is covered by cover crops and minimize the amount that remains exposed during the growing season. So that's one of the things that there's been a fair bit of work on in the past several years and that I've been involved with. Probably the other big area that's starting to emerge and that I'm getting more involved in is kind of different aspects of digital agriculture and digital viticulture that's coming to growers. So one of the things that we're trying to do now is there's been a lot of work on kind of all the research and technology development, and now we need to start working on how the best way is to bring that technology to the industry. It's getting to the point now where it is commercially viable for growers to start using some of these things. And so I'm involved with a few different projects and different aspects of projects looking at how can we take some of these different sensors, different images, different types of signals that we can collect about the vineyard and make them tools that growers can use and make to improve their management.
I think it was on your Twitter timeline, that the European Union is now allowing the use of hybrid grapes in some of the name regions where previously it had to be just specifically the vinifera grapes as a battle against climate. Are we seeing climate change affecting the grape crop in the Finger Lakes, and what's the research on mitigating that?
We're definitely seeing impacts from climate change in the Finger Lakes. So my predecessors in this program in the past have maintained kind of a long ongoing database of weather data, going back to the early 70s at least, pretty detailed stuff that I've continued to maintain. And when we look at the number of, we look at a measure called growing degree days, which is basically a way to calculate the heat accumulation during a growing season. And what we've seen is that since 2002, when you look at the 10-year average of those growing degree days per season, since 2002, it's on a pretty straight line up. Kind of looks, kind of a classic hockey stick kind of thing. So we've increased by about 15% in about 20 years, which is quite a bit. So we are seeing warmer seasons. We're seeing more when we do get rains. We're getting them more. We're getting heavier rains, and then we're getting longer periods of drought in between those. And so one of the things that we're having to start to look at, and one of the things that the European Union is kind of recognizing about some of these more modern varieties that are being bred, is that they have improved resilience to some of these different things, whether it's fluctuating temperatures, whether it's better disease resistance when you have wetter growing seasons, things like this. So it's been encouraging to see, to my mind at least, it's been encouraging to see regions like in Europe, especially, that have very strict rules about what can be grown and what can't, starting to relax those a little bit with and acknowledging kind of the reality of what's happening and helping the industry to react to that.
Let's talk about pest management. Is the spotted lanternfly a threat to grapes?
Sure is. I think it's still a very new pest. I mean, this thing was just found in Pennsylvania 6 or 7 years ago. So in the grand scheme of kind of pest management, I mean, we've known about powdery mildew for a couple thousand years, and we've tried to study how to control that, and we're still working on it. So the amount of information we have about the spotted lanternfly in that time is pretty extraordinary, but there's still a lot we don't know. We do know that grapes are a preferred host for them. This tree of heaven, or Ailanthus, some people might know it as, seems to be the preferred host. They're kind of their primary host that attracts them the most. But right after that seems to be grapes. And we're not quite sure why that is. There are plenty of other plants that they will feed on also, but grapes seem to be one that they really like. And so the concern with them is not so much that they can impact the fruit itself. They don't feed on the fruit or on the leaves. They feed on the sap that runs up and down the trunk and the shoots. And so basically, if enough of them get onto a grapevine, and they have this very strong aggregation habit, so they all tend to clump together in certain spots. If you get a whole bunch of them on one grapevine, they can almost kind of literally suck the life out of it. So the concern is that if you get enough of them in a big enough population over time, they can start to basically kill vines. There are a couple of examples in Pennsylvania where that's happened, a few acres of it. So it's definitely a concern. We're watching it very closely. A number of us who are in viticulture in New York are participating in working groups and meetings and that kind of stuff, just kind of keeping an ear open for what's happening. But ultimately with these things, it's a matter of not if, but when. We've found individual adults in the Finger Lakes. Some people might remember there was a population, some egg masses found in the Ithaca area last year. The Department of Ag and Markets has been working really hard to try to eradicate as much of that population as they can, because of the proximity of the Finger Lakes industry to that area. There's been a pretty big find this year in Binghamton. There's a pretty well-established population down there now. So it is coming. It's just a matter of, can we be prepared? Can we find them early enough where we can start to take some of the actions that we can to keep them under some semblance of management so that, we can learn how to live with them. I don't think we'll ever eradicate them probably once they're established here. But I think we can probably figure out ways to minimize their impact.
On the Finger Lakes Grape Program page, one of your areas of interest is grower and winery relations and bringing the two together. What are some issues where the interests of the grower and the interests of the winemaker diverge?
Well, I think some of it is some of what we've been trying to focus on. When I say we, I'm my colleagues who work in the enology extension lab at Cornell Agritech in Geneva. I work with them a lot. And one of the things that we've tried to do in some of our efforts in that area are just basically getting growers and winemakers to understand each other's issues and needs, and just what some of the terms are that they talk about. So, lingo and terminology and what's important to you versus what's important to you. A number of winemakers have very long histories with certain growers, and they communicate very well with them, and that's great. We have some really great relationships between wineries and growers, and obviously a lot of wineries have their own vineyards as well, and so they kind of work very closely with the vineyard managers that work at their places. But there's still plenty of wineries that purchase from who don't have their own vineyards that also don't have their own vineyards, and so they purchase from other growers. So what we try to do in that sense is just try to get both sides to kind of understand where each other is coming from. Some of what I was just mentioning about the price per acre versus price per ton is part of that whole conversation. So I think, and trying to get winemakers, coming from a viticulture perspective like I am, one of the things that we really try to do is help winemakers to understand just what are the impacts of the things that we do in the vineyard and what things don't necessarily have an impact. You probably know there's this long-held notion in the wine industry that if you have to get better quality fruit, you have to have smaller yields, and that's generally not necessarily true. It can be true on certain occasions, but there's it's a much more complicated thing than just reducing how much yield you produce and having better quality. But there are still a number of winemakers who believe that. I think less so in the Finger Lakes than maybe others, but hopefully that's because of what we've been doing. But so we try to talk to winemakers about not just that's not true. It's more about here's what the research has shown about this, and that's kind of our game. We work in research. Here's what the research has shown about this idea of how much crop do you have versus what's the quality like. And so, yes, there can be situations where that could be true, but is that true with the grower that you're working with and in this given season, in this given vineyard, and that kind of stuff. And so it's a lot of trying to just get the wineries and the growers to be able to talk from the same book, at least, if not necessarily always on the same page.
All right, same last question I always ask you. It's always about the state of the research and what's next. What's the unanswered question that keeps you up at night?
Ooh, boy. There are two. The first one is, who is going to run these vineyards 30, 40 years from now? This is not just a situation. It's not just a situation in viticulture and in vineyards. It's true in farming in general. Who's going to run the farms? There's been a lot of talk about the need for kind of the temporary labor, the hand labor that does a lot of the work in the fields themselves. But we're also struggling with who's going to work these, who's going to manage those vineyards, who's going to manage those workers in the next 20 to 30 years. And that's something that is, I think, is a real issue that we need to think about, and then that could become problematic down the road. So there's some things that can be done. There's some things that the industry is starting to do as far as reaching out to younger people and in high schools and things like that. But so that's one issue that I kind of think about. And the other is kind of tied to that in that how do we make management and good vineyard practices viable for a smaller group of people? How do we make it so that you don't need a crew of 20 to take care of a 100-acre vineyard, for example? You can do it with a crew of 6 or 8, and still produce good fruit and be profitable and all those things. So that gets into some of the digital agriculture stuff that I was mentioning earlier, so that management is more efficient and productive. Some of that comes down to mechanization. Most people have probably, if you live in the Finger Lakes, you've probably seen a grape harvester running up and down around the Finger Lakes. But so the vast majority of grapes in here are picked by machine, but the vast majority of pruning is still done by hand. I think we're going to have to start looking at good ways of pruning these premium wine grapes that are viable and efficient for growers. So it's those kinds of things that I think are kind of where we need to be focusing our future work, or a lot of our future work at least.
I'll be looking forward to hearing the answers to those questions in years to come. This has been Inside the FLX from FingerLakes1.com. I'm Ted Baker. My guest has been Hans Walter-Peterson, Viticulture Extension Specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension. Always good to talk to you. Appreciate the time. Thanks a lot.
Anytime, Ted. Thank you so much.